Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
True crime with a dash of the paranormal, the garish, the strange, and the darkly comic. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and you've found your way to Kinda Murdery, a place that means more than just murder. It's my very own pocket dimension, home to a curated collection of bizarre and compelling stories, the unsolved, the unsettling, and the unbelievable. I cover it all, just so long as it's kinda murdery. Welcome, everybody. I'm your host, Zevin Odelberg, and this is Kinda Murdery. I gotta tell you guys, I am excited today because we are kicking off Bonnie and Clyde. This story is bonkers. It's not just kinda murdery, it's very murdery, and it is wild. I mean, it's a wild story about some of the most famous American outlaws there ever has been, and I gotta tell you that I think I've figured out a little bit why it is that they're so much more famous than Dale Jones and Margie Dean, and it's not just the advent of the radio, although that's part of it, but I'm not going to get into that now because we've got a multi-part story here and I don't want any spoilers. What I am going to do is get straight into the story, so here we go. It's time to make like beloved Eddie Munson. Let's meddle. Kinda Murdery starts right now. A man carried a yellow-haired little boy about 2 years old through Roosevelt Park in San Antonio, Texas, the evening of August 13th, 1928. He was an insignificant-looking fellow, just 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighing only 110 pounds. His cheeks were somewhat sunken, and his hair had not been trimmed in several weeks. He was so commonplace a figure that he escaped the notice of the dozens of men and women enjoying the cool night air on the park benches. But he did not escape the notice of Patrolman W.T. Mitchell. In fact, Patrolman Mitchell was so interested in the fellow that he dodged from tree to tree to observe him better. He had seen the man with the baby tampering with motor cars. Although the man merely might be interested in automobiles, the officer was taking no chances. As Patrolman Mitchell watched, the fellow tried several door handles. They were locked. He attempted unsuccessfully to turn on some ignition switches. Finally, after examining 8 cars, he turned on the switch of a Whippet Roadster, placed the baby on the seat, climbed in, and started the motor. The officer rushed from his cover, shouting, "Stop! Wait!" The surprised man leapt from the car and raced down the street. The baby wailed, "Daddy!" and began to cry. For several blocks, the fleeing man and the pursuing officer darted in and out of crowds on the sidewalks. Then the fugitive dodged into an alley. Breathing hard, Patrolman Mitchell cornered his man in the garage, grasped him by the shirt collar, and dragged him into the dim light cast by a street lamp. The prisoner whimpered. Fear was written in his chestnut eyes. He begged the officer to turn him loose. Patrolman Mitchell had only contempt for the cowardly creature. He did not know that this terrified petty thief would one day be known as one of the Bloody Barrows. When Patrolman Mitchell reached headquarters with Marvin Ivan, later to be Buck Barrow, he learned that his captive already was known to Chief Owen W. Kilday. He had been in minor trouble at Dallas, his hometown, and was under suspended sentence of a year in jail for car theft at Waxahachie, Texas. A misdemeanor warrant charging attempted motor theft was filed against Barrow in County Court No. 1. He was released on bond. On the date for his trial, he failed to appear. Several weeks later, he was found and placed in the county jail. For some reason not revealed by the records, the case against him was dismissed January 23, 1929. But police began to watch him more closely. He had no apparent means of support, and soon rumors began to float through the underworld that Buck Barrow was, quote, in right, unquote, with desperate criminals, that he was leaving petty crime for, quote, the big time. Police obtained evidence on October 13, 1929, that there was something to the new underworld estimate of Barrow. Several men were surprised in an attempt to blow open the safe of a lumberyard at 2521 Florence Street in North Dallas. The cracksmen escaped, but acting later on a tip, Detectives Smith and Heron arrested Buck Barrow and 3 other men for questioning. One of these men was Dan Black, a notorious yegg. A yegg, by the way, is old-timey slang for a safecracker. Another was Frank Claus, a former convict, and the third man was Buck's younger brother, Clyde Champion Barrow. the man who was to travel with him on an unbelievable trail of death and crime. Clyde Barrow, like his brother, had a previous police record and was the same sort of undersized, shifty-eyed individual. Evidence to convict the group of the attempt on the lumberyard safe was lacking, but under a promise of no prosecution, Clyde made a confession implicating the gang in scores of safe robberies in Dallas, Houston, and other Texas cities. Because of the bargain made to obtain Clyde's confession, the gang was freed. On October 27, 1929, a Chevrolet Coupe was stolen on the street at Henrietta, Texas. The license number was sent to police officers all over the state. 3 days later, a patrolman in Denton, Texas, saw a car bearing the license and carrying 4 men. He forced the car to the curb. In it were Buck and Clyde Barrow, Sidney Albert Moore of Waco, Texas, and Roger Pug Mitchell of Dallas. Buck accepted responsibility for the theft and on January 14, 1930, began a 4-year sentence in the state prison at Huntsville as prisoner number 63051. Several counties contended for the privilege of prosecuting Clyde Barrow. He was sent to Waco on March 2, 1930, and there confessed to 2 burglaries and 5 motor thefts. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison on 1 charge, the others being held in abeyance. Buck Barrow seemed such a docile sort of prisoner that prison authorities did not feel it necessary to confine him closely. He belied that estimate of his character by walking away from the penitentiary on March 8th. Prison officials still were distributing posters offering a reward for the arrest of Buck when Clyde escaped from the Waco jail on March 11, 1930. With William Turner and Emory Abernathy also prisoners, he forced his way past the guard. Nothing was learned about the fugitives for a week. Then, 3 bandits robbed the station of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad at Middletown, Ohio, early in the afternoon of March 18th. While the police were searching for them, the same bandits entered a dry cleaning plant, robbed the manager, and ran into the street. Passing officers caught them as they emerged. The outlaws admitted the holdups to Roy W. Schofield, chief of police, but refused to divulge their identities. However, their fingerprints were checked and they were found to be Clyde Barrow, William Turner, and Emory Abernathy. When Clyde Barrow was returned to Waco on March 21st, the 6 charges held in abeyance were invoked, and on March 24th he was sentenced to 2 years on each count, making a total sentence of 14 years that he faced when he entered the Huntsville prison on April 21, 1930. Months passed with no news of Buck Barrow. His name appeared in public print only once when his wife divorced him. Inside the prison, meanwhile, Clyde spent several weeks in the hospital. He had been assigned to a task that required the use of an axe. He showed up one day with 2 toes of his right foot missing. He said, and the authorities accepted the explanation, that it had been an accident. His fellow prisoners smiled grimly. They knew he had severed the toes deliberately to avoid work. As time dragged on, officials despaired of ever returning Buck Barrow to his cell. Then, after almost 2 years, when hope of finding him was at its lowest, he walked into the penitentiary, December 27, 1931, and surrendered. Prison authorities were astounded and asked Buck what had led him to this action. "A woman," he smiled. "Shortly after I escaped, I met a girl down in the country. We fell for each other. Her name was Blanche Caldwell, and she was just a good, honest country girl who had lived most of her life on the farm. The 1st of last July, we went to Idabel, Oklahoma, and got a marriage license. We were married 3 days later at America, Oklahoma. Finally, I told her all about myself. She begged me to come back here and serve my time so we could live like other people, so here I am." Clyde was eligible for parole early in the new year, and since his record as a prisoner was clear, Governor R.S. Sterling acted favorably on his application. On February 2, 1932, Clyde returned to Dallas. Soon afterward, on the street, he met a small woman who attracted him. He stared at her, and she smiled at him. They spoke. After a moment's conversation, they walked down the street together. Thus casually met one of the most heartless criminal pairs of modern times. From the date of this chance meeting, Clyde and the woman were often seen together, usually in speakeasies where the woman paid the bills. They were a couple that attracted attention. Clyde, with his small size, his weak chin, and his soft hazel eyes and wavy brown hair, seemed effeminate. In contrast, the woman liked to wear masculine clothes. Her mouth was hard, her hair a striking yellow, and she habitually smoked big black cigars. The police investigated her quietly. They learned that she worked as a waitress, and while she used her maiden name, Bonnie Parker, she was the wife of a sober, industrious man. The manager of Sims Oil Company looked up from his desk in his office at Dallas on March 25, 1932, and into the muzzle of a semi-automatic pistol. Quickly, the bandit emptied the victim's pockets and ransacked his safe. At police headquarters an hour later, the manager identified a picture of the bandit. He was Clyde Barrow. Less than 2 months had passed since his parole. Detectives rushed to the usual haunts of Clyde Barrow. Others went to shadow Bonnie Parker. But Barrow was not found, and Bonnie Parker had not been at work that day. A pickup order was issued for Barrow, and when Bonnie Parker failed to appear at work the next day, the order was amended to include her. 2 bandits rushed in K.R. Biven, night operator of the Magnolia service station at 789 South 1st Street in Lufkin, Texas, at 2 o'clock in the morning of April 24, 1932. "Get your hat," one of them ordered. "You're going out for a little air." Biven was robbed of $26, a .38 caliber revolver, and shoved into a Chrysler 70 coupe that stood at the curb. 4 blocks down the street, the bandits stopped at the Gulf service station, where they seized Herman Miller, night manager, after robbing him of $9 and a revolver. The car sped south out of town. As its lights split the dense darkness, there was no hint from the bandits as to what they intended to do with their captives. 2 miles outside of town, the hearts of the captives sank as the car stopped abruptly. They were ordered out. One of the bandits got out too. He faced his quaking victims and leveled his revolver. Then a faint smile played on his lips. "You can go," he said. Biven and Miller ran to town and notified R.C. Chansey, chief of police, who at once organized a pursuit. At 5 o'clock that morning, Dan Richards, a railroad man, found the Chrysler at the east edge of town. It had been stolen earlier in the night from the home of W.B. Keene of Lufkin. On the chance that the bandits might be from one of the larger cities, Chief Chauncey took Biven and Miller to Dallas. There, from the thousands of photographs in the Police Bureau of Identification, Biven picked pictures of Clyde Barrow and Frank Claus as his abductors. Miller, who had seen the outlaws only in the dark, was unable to make identification. The search for Barrow was intensified, but for 6 days no trace of him was found. John M. Butcher, 61 years old, had been a businessman in Hillsboro, Texas for 35 years. For more than 20 years, his establishment was on the courthouse square of this town of 8,000 persons. At first, he had only a jewelry store, but when bicycles became popular, he established a bicycle repair shop in conjunction. Then the motor car replaced the bicycle, and he added automobile accessories and a filling station. Then, 8 or 9 years ago, a new north and south paved highway was constructed through Hillsboro. Mr. Butcher saw an opportunity. He left his location on the square and built a 2-story structure of reinforced concrete on the new road, north of the square and just inside the city limits. No other building was near it. In front were the gasoline pumps. The first floor was devoted to an accessory business and the jewelry shop. A stairway led from the rear of the store to the second floor where Mr. Butcher lived with his wife. Shortly after noon, on Wednesday, April 27, 1932, a car stopped in front of the store. At the wheel was a young woman whose striking yellow hair would have been noticed anywhere. The 2 young men with her got out and walked into the store. Butcher walked forward to greet them. One carried a small package. He led the jeweler toward the rear of the establishment. "We'd like to sell you some pocket knives." "I've got plenty," Butcher replied, "but I might buy 'em if the price is right." The package was unwrapped. While Butcher examined the knives, he noticed that the second man was walking around the store, carefully examining every corner of it. For the moment, Butcher felt a sense of uneasiness. Why was the fellow so curious? However, the salesman of the pair seemed so anxious to sell the knives that the jeweler decided his own anxiety was baseless. He turned his attention to the driving of the bargain. The man with the knives wanted more for them than Butcher was willing to pay. They contended over the price in such loud tones that Mrs. Butcher went downstairs to see what was taking place. For several minutes she listened with amusement to the good-natured bickering, fixing the faces of the strange men firmly in her memory. Then, after her husband had obtained the knives at his price and the men had gone, she returned to her sewing. 3 days passed. The knife episode was all but forgotten. Saturday was a long day for Mr. and Mrs. Butcher, and they did not retire until nearly midnight. They were still awake when someone outside called Butcher's name. Appeals for aid from motorists stranded on the highway were not unusual at any hour. Butcher walked to the window and called down cheerfully, "What can I do for you?" "Will you sell me some guitar strings?" was the answer. A sense of danger gripped Butcher. Why should a man want guitar strings at that hour? Soberly, he drew on his dressing gown and thrust a .45 caliber Colt pistol under the drawstring of his pajamas. His hand held ready on the butt of the weapon, he descended the stairs and opened the front door. A man stood there, smiling. "Well, I'm sorry to disturb you," he apologized, "but we were having a little party and I need some guitar strings. I hope you don't mind." Butcher breathed easier. His hand came away from the pistol. The fellow was one of the men who had sold the jeweler the knives 3 days earlier. All right, we're back. Thank you so much for donating a little bit of your time to support the brands that support Kinda Murdery. Also, please do leave reviews. They trigger algorithms that make the show more visible. The more visible it gets, the more excited I get, the better these stories can be. Let's do this together, guys. Let's make it a group effort. Now, as you know, I like to do shout-outs right here. I have a very special shout-out today. I've mentioned often how I have cerebral palsy and I want Kinda Murdery to be a support community for people with disabilities. And I got a review a couple days ago that really moved me. It really meant a lot to me. So today's shout out goes to Ryan Downer from Bentleyville, Pennsylvania. And here's what Ryan had to say in his review that he left on the Apple Podcasts app. It says, "Very well produced with extremely interesting content. Love listening while I work and look forward to each episode. My uncle had cerebral palsy. He had zero use of his legs and had crutches his whole life. I used to carry him up and down our steps when he came to visit so he wouldn't have to wear himself out. Thanks for all you're doing and keep up the good work. I'd love some stickers. I'll put them on the window of my truck." I gotta tell you guys, I got a little bit choked up reading that. That's exactly the kind of outreach that I would like for us all to have together. Ryan shared with me that his uncle has passed on now, RIP. And his uncle's CP was much more severe than mine is. But I think it's so valuable for us to be able to share stories like this because I think everyone has their struggles. And sometimes when another person's struggle is not your own, it can be hard to connect to it. If you don't see it, if you don't hear about it, it's like they almost become characters from some kind of fairy story that's not totally real. But the more real what everybody's going through can become for all of us, the more empathy and compassion we can have for each other. And that's what I hope to facilitate with the show and with the wonderful community we're building together. So Ryan Downer from Bentleyville, Pennsylvania, thank you so much for being willing to be open enough to share that personal story with me and with all of us. God bless you and God bless your uncle. And with that, let's get back into some ultra-violent romance, shall we? Wheels, Barrows, and Blood, the Badlands romance of Bonnie and Clyde, returns now. Appeals for aid from motorists stranded on the highway were not unusual at any hour. Butcher walked to the window and called down cheerfully, "What can I do for you?" "Will you sell me some guitar strings?" was the answer. A sense of danger gripped Butcher. Why should a man want guitar strings at that hour? Soberly, he drew on his dressing gown and thrust a .45 caliber Colt pistol under the drawstring of his pajamas. His hand held ready on the butt of the weapon, he descended the stairs and opened the front door. A man stood there, smiling. "Well, I'm sorry to disturb you," he apologized, "but we were having a little party and I need some guitar strings. I hope you don't mind." Butcher breathed easier. His hand came away from the pistol. The fellow was one of the men who had sold the jeweler the knives 3 days earlier. The proprietor led the way to the musical strings case at the rear of the store near the safe. The customer made his selection with a care that marked him as an expert. While Butcher and his customer were busy at the back of the store, a second man walked into the front door and leaned against the counter. The guitar strings were wrapped. Butcher and the purchaser walked toward the front, the man drawing out a billfold as they went. At the door, he handed Butcher a $10 bill. "I'm sorry. It's the smallest I have." "Well, I'll have to get some change," Butcher replied. The merchant went to the foot of the stairs and called to his wife. "Mama, I have to get some change for a 10. Will you come down and open the safe?" Mrs. Butcher hurriedly drew a garment over her nightclothes and went downstairs. She recognized the men and nodded to them as she whirled the dial and swung open the safe. A scream of horror escaped the woman as she turned around. Her husband's face was a mask of terror. The congenial customers had become snarling madmen. Ugly pistols flashed in their hands. Without a single word of warning, one of them sent a bullet through the heart of Butcher, who stiffened, clutched his chest, and fell dead at his wife's feet. The old-fashioned gun, which he was given no opportunity to use, clattered on the floor. A circle of blood spread on his dressing gown as the grayness of death came to his face. Filled with a terrible despair, the woman whisked the weapon from the floor and swung it toward the bandits, but she was too slow. A pistol ground into her ribs, and a voice barked, "Put it on the counter or you'll get the same thing." Knowing that these cold-blooded killers would murder her unless she obeyed, Mrs. Butcher laid the weapon on the counter and sobbed hysterically. One of the bandits snatched up Butcher's pistol. Then, coolly stepping over the body of his victim, the desperado went to the safe and removed about $40 in money and $2,500 worth of diamonds. The slayers ran out the front door. Through the thick walls of the store there came faintly to Mrs. Butcher the roar of a speeding motor car. With the nearest help blocks away, Mrs. Butcher knelt by the body of her husband, sobbing and praying. Realizing that she must do something, she fought to control her emotions. After a few minutes, she forced her way upstairs to the telephone and called Sheriff J.W. Freeland of Hill County. With Deputy Sheriffs Robert Wilkinson and Kelly Rush, Sheriff Freeland rushed to the scene of the murder of his old friend. Hastily, he drew from the widow an account of the tragedy. Appalled by the savage outrage, the sheriff, within a few minutes, set in motion one of the greatest manhunts known to Texas. In towns 50, 100, and 200 miles away, officers were roused from their sleep and ordered to take up the search. City Marshal E. Leo Keaton organized a posse in Hillsborough, and scores of men, eager to avenge the death of their respected townsmen, sped along the highways. So thoroughly was the hunt organized that it seemed impossible that the killers could escape. Yet the hours dragged on with no trace of them. So aroused was Sheriff Freeland that he asked the newspapers to publish an appeal for help over his signature. It was headed, "To all police officers, help me catch these brutal murderers and robbers." Governor Sterling ordered the famous Texas Rangers into the search and issued a proclamation offering a reward of $250 for the arrest of the slayers. Angry citizens gathered on corners and demanded action as the hours wore on, and officers labored without sleep. Then, Sunday morning, it seemed the case had taken a favorable turn. 2 men, known criminals who answered to the descriptions of the Butcher killers, were arrested in Fort Worth, Texas. Sheriff Freeland hurriedly brought them to Hillsborough, and Mrs. Butcher agreed to view them. For only an instant did the sorrowing woman hesitate. "They're not the men," she said. The disappointment made the officers more determined than ever. When a 3:00 bus rolled into Hillsborough Monday morning, Night Marshals C.J. Smith and Ward Russell were waiting for it. A small man stepped off and was immediately arrested. The officers hurried him to the office of Sheriff Freeland. Daylight came. The questioning of the man went on and on. Word spread that one of the killers was in custody. A crowd gathered outside the sheriff's office. Finally, the sheriff emerged. The crowd swarmed around him. Excited questions were hurled from all sides. "I am satisfied that the fellow has no connection," the sheriff said. No hint of the killer's identity had been received at 3:00 Monday afternoon when funeral services for Butcher were held at the First Baptist Church. After the burial, Sheriff Freeland questioned Mrs. Butcher more closely. He found every detail of the slaying etched deeply in her memory. She told of the knife episode and described the killers minutely. Both seemed to be about 22 years old, but while one was extremely small, only about 5'7" tall, the other was about 5'11". She was positive she would be able to identify them anywhere, under any circumstances. From other sources, Sheriff Freeland heard of a woman with brilliant yellow hair who had been seen in a town with 2 men. Her description sounded familiar. Where had he seen it? The sheriff went to the office and was thumbing through posters advertising wanted criminals. Within a few minutes, he found what he wanted. The woman fit the description of Bonnie Parker. The small man might be Clyde Barrow. But who could the second man be? Frank Claus had been with Barrow in the Lufkin robberies. Could he have been in the Butcher killing too? The sheriff took pictures of Clyde Barrow and Claus to Mrs. Butcher. She studied them intently a moment. Then she said, "That man was certainly one of them." The picture she held forward to the sheriff was of Clyde Barrow. For the first time, one of the bloody Barrows was wanted for a killing. "He was not the other one," Mrs. Butcher said as she returned the picture of Claus. Quickly, Sheriff Freeland spread the news that Clyde Barrow had been identified as the murderer of Butcher. He asked police departments at San Antonio, Houston, Dallas, and Fort Worth to give him complete information concerning all past associates of the merciless desperado. Pictures and descriptions began to arrive by the dozens. One by one, Mrs. Butcher examined them, but always her decision was the same. "He is not the man." Then, when it seemed that the mystery of the identity of the second man could not be solved, a new lot of pictures was shown Mrs. Butcher. She picked one up from the group and exclaimed, "Here he is! Here he is!" She had selected a picture of Raymond Hamilton, a Dallas criminal who for several years had been associated with Clyde Barrow. The fevered search for Clyde Barrow, Hamilton, and Bonnie Parker went on, but months passed with only vague traces of them. A series of filling station robberies occurred in the state. In many of them, the bandit car was driven by a woman. Officers believed the robberies were committed by Barrow and his companions, but there was no definite proof. Then there came an underworld rumor that the Barrow gang had taken refuge in the hills about Nacogdoches, Texas, the birthplace of Clyde. Gangland informants warned the police that Barrow would not be taken alive. They said he realized he was a marked man and that he had collected a large supply of arms and ammunition, and that the gang had established a target range at its hideout where shooting was practiced regularly in preparation for the meeting with officers that was certain to come sooner or later. A squad of Texas Rangers under Sergeant C.H. Plott swooped into the territory. They did not capture the gang, but they did find the target range. Marks had been improvised from wrapping paper. Dozens of empty shotgun rifle and pistol cartridges indicated how seriously the practice had been taken. A few cigar butts that bore unmistakable traces of lipstick showed that Bonnie Parker was still with the gang. It seemed that the career of the Barrow gang would end in a bloody episode. If so, the officers were ready. A more determined effort than ever was made to run the gang to the earth. It was not until August 1st, 1932 that definite trace of the outlaws was found again. That day, a bandit entered the office of the Neuhoff Packing Company at Dallas and robbed the Neuhoff brothers of several $100s and some diamond rings. The Neuhoffs identified Clyde Barrow as the bandit, but the trail was lost almost as soon as it was found. While Dallas police alertly awaited a new outrage in that city, the locale of the manhunt shifted hundreds of miles. A country dance was in progress at Stringtown near Atoka, Oklahoma, the night of Friday, August 5, 1932. Desiring no rowdyism, the management had requested Sheriff C.G. Maxwell of Atoka County to attend. He was present with Undersheriff Eugene C. Moore. Until 11 o'clock, everything went smoothly. Shortly before that time, 4 men drove up in a car bearing a Texas license plate. They remained in the car several minutes, talking in low tones. Then they got out, walked to another car, and climbed in. "Let's see who they are," Under Sheriff Moore said to his superior. The officers approached the group. Sheriff Maxwell saw one of the men tilt a whiskey bottle. "Consider yourselves under arrest," he said. Flashes of flame spurted from the car. 4 guns belched lead. Without a chance to draw their weapons, the officers crumpled before the deadly hail. Under Sheriff Moore, shot through the heart and head, died where he fell. Sheriff Maxwell, struck in the chest, side, arms, and wrist, and the legs, writhed on the ground. Inside the dance hall, the sharp gunfire sounded above the music. The rhythm broke. Panic-stricken, the dancers rushed out of the doors. Young women screamed and fainted at the sight of the bleeding officers. Their escorts, pale with anger and horror, were forced to stand by helplessly as the butchery went on. Firing a last burst at the prone officers, the gangsters leapt into the car with the Texas license and sped away. Using his last strength, Sheriff Maxwell raised himself on an elbow, drew his revolver, and emptied it into the rear of the madly racing car. The outlaw car swung crazily from side to side as it roared on. Quickly, the men at the dance snatched up the weapons of the fallen officers and organized a pursuit. Car lights shone like meteors as they swung in behind the fleeing desperados and dashed through the night at a speed so terrific that death lurked in every turn of the wheels. Suddenly, the murderer's car swung too near the edge of the road. For a moment, it poised on 2 wheels. Then it crashed into a ditch and rolled over. Cleve Brady of Stringtown saw the crash. He saw limping men crawl from the wreckage and stopped to see if he could be of help. He found himself looking into the muzzles of revolvers. The outlaws forced him from his car, and entering it themselves, they went on east at breakneck speed. 15 miles east of Stringtown, the left rear wheel flew from the car. The machine spun around in the road, sending up a cloud of dust. One gangster was thrown clear, but when the others piled out, he was able to continue the flight. Running until they were out of breath, walking, then running again, the outlaws reached the farm home of John Redden. One of them rapped sharply on the door. "We've had a wreck, a bad one," Redden was told. "Can you help us get this injured man to a doctor?" Redden's son offered to help. Out of sight of the farmhouse, a revolver jammed into his side, and he was ordered to drive east. Near Clayton, Oklahoma, young Redden was set free, and the bandits stole a car belonging to Frank Smith of Seminole. With Sheriff Maxwell near death after an emergency operation in a McAllister hospital, District Judge P.L. Gassaway appointed O.C. Elkins, a former undersheriff, to take charge of the sheriff's office temporarily. Large posses scoured the countryside all night, and the next day Elkins called other peace officers in to aid him. C.A. Burns, chief of the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, O.P. Ray, assistant chief of operatives, C.M. Reber and D. Arthur Wilson, and sheriffs from McAllister, Colgate, Antlers, and Durant all hurried to Atoka. They agreed that Maxwell and Moore probably had surprised some badly wanted men. The first step toward the solution of the crime would be identification of those men. As quickly as possible, they checked up on the motor car in which the killers had driven to the dance. It had been stolen Friday morning at Corsicana, Texas. While frantic search was being conducted for the car stolen at Clayton, word was received that a badly wounded man had been found in a tourist camp near the Red River Bridge south of Durant, Oklahoma. Officers sped to question him. The man was James Acker of Dinsboro, Texas, a former convict. He denied, however, that he had been wounded by Sheriff Maxwell. He insisted that he had never been near Atoka or Stringtown and claimed he had been robbed of $7 by a bandit who shot him when he protested. While not satisfied with the story, officers were unable to discredit it. and Acker was surrendered to Sherman, Texas authorities who held a warrant for him. Sunday afternoon, the car stolen by the killers at Clayton was found at Grandview, a little town near Dallas, Texas. Officers were amazed at the spectacular distance covered in the flight. The murderers had come from Texas and fled to Texas. That fact was considered significant. Gathering all available descriptions of the slayers, Elkins telegraphed them to numerous Texas cities asking for pictures of men who the descriptions might fit. 2 of the many photographs received were at once recognized by those who had seen the killers. Sheriff Maxwell, from his hospital bed, removed all doubt of the identifications. The men were Clyde Barrow and Raymond Hamilton. The true meaning had been read in the sinister target practice on the range near Nacogdoches. Now, wanted for 2 murders, Barrow and Hamilton dashed across hundreds of miles in a frantic effort to escape the gigantic net spread for them throughout the Southwest. Their evil luck held. 6 days later, and 1,500 miles away, they struck again. Shortly before noon, Saturday, August 14, 1932, Deputy Sheriff Joe Johns was patrolling the streets of Carlsbad, New Mexico, a town in the southeast corner of the state, 80 miles west of the Texas line. A Ford V8 sedan passed him. He glimpsed the license number. He had received a report earlier that a car bearing that number had been stolen. Speeding up, he drove alongside the car and forced it to the curb. 2 men were in the front seat. The rear seat was occupied by a woman with bright yellow hair. The deputy explained that he wanted to check the motor number. Drawing his revolver and watching the men from the corner of his eye, he raised the hood. He was astonished to hear the woman's voice say, "Pile in here or I'll blow you up." The shotgun pointed at him was held with a steady hand. The officer did not have a fighting chance to use his revolver. To resist meant certain death and no possible advantage. Reluctantly, the officer got in the car and was whisked away. Witnesses reported the kidnapping to authorities. Deadly fear swept over the friends of John's as the abductors were described to them. There seemed to be no doubt that the luckless man had fallen into the hands of Barrow, Hamilton, and Bonnie Parker. The mercy he could expect was small. Where will the outlaw Barrows and blonde Jezebel Bonnie Parker strike next? How long can they avoid law enforcement's massive dragnet? Find out by tuning into Kinda Murdery on Thursday, August 25th for part 2 of Wheels, Barrows, and Blood, the Badlands romance of Bonnie and Clyde. I'll see you there. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery. If you've enjoyed today's Kinda Murdery, please tell your friends and family. Tell strangers. Leave a review. It's the best way to ensure that I can keep telling that special brand of bizarre and terrible tales that you'll only find here on Kinda Murdery.